Good morning, Lord Mayor, Taoiseach, President of UCC, Minister Coveney, elected representatives, City Manager, ladies and gentlemen, UCC students and staff. You are all very welcome to University College Cork and to the Aula Maxima. The weather is less than ideal this morning, but as the Taoiseach just said to us, he's used to this weather where he comes from. We extend to the Taoiseach and to everyone a very warm Cork welcome. My name is Andrew Cotty. I'm head of the Department of Government here at UCC, and I'll be chairing this morning's event. This is the Department of Government's 15th annual Philip Monahan Lecture, named in honour of one of the leading contributors to the development of Irish local government. We in the Department of Government are very proud to continue the tradition of prominent speakers giving the Philip Monahan Lecture. Without further ado, I will now call on the President of UCC, Dr. Michael Murphy, to introduce the Taoiseach. Please, President.
Thank you very much, Lord Mayor, Taoiseach, Minister, Deputies, Senators, Councillors, distinguished guests, students and colleagues. On behalf of the University, it is an honour for me to welcome Taoiseach Enda Kenny on his first official visit to UCC. He adds, of course, to a stellar roll of previous lecturers, who included Mary McAleese, John Hume, the Mayor of Rome, and last year, of course, John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons. And Kenny was first elected to the Dáil from Mayo in 1975. He's been a member of Mayo County Council from 1975 to 1995 and has a remarkable track record of 11 successful consecutive general elections, which makes him the longest serving TD in Dáil Éireann. Leader of the Fine Gael party since 2002, he was elected Taoiseach in 2011. His topic this morning is on the renewal of the public service, and it has been said that the quality of any nation's public service determines the quality of a nation's life. Public service must evolve, but its traditional values, which include universalism and equity, must be preserved, while it modernises and while it professionalises for greater performance and results. The ideal of service to the citizen must be at the forefront of any reform efforts. And Taoiseach is now going to address this topic on the future direction of the Irish public service as he delivers the 15th Philip Monahan Lecture. Taoiseach, you are most welcome to UCC. Gur maith agat.
Advera, ar a rialtas, Uachtarán, Olscoil na hÉireann Corcaí, one of the pipe leaguers going to Uisle, more mention of McLean. But while I'm so those, my voice at Lachel and Ranog rialtas in Shaw, Colossia Olscoil Corcaí, I saw that Currahustam, Tacht was Lecht, Philip Monahan, and what you imagine. I've just had the remarkable experience of having an engagement with some of the staff of the university, respective George Boole. I feel completely inadequate after seeing in brief the reflections and the work of one of the world's great mathematicians, and the letter written about him in 1866, that between himself and other brilliant people, that they put together the process leading to the thinking machine. Interesting that we're here in Cork so many years later, where you have some of the leading companies in the world dealing with the thinking machines. So thought process is very important. When I was Minister for Tourism, I remember looking at all the advertisements and all the postcards from the John Hind postcards on, and every one of them suggested or seemed to say that we had wonderful sunny weather in Ireland all the time. I said, don't you realise that in the National Park in Connemara it rains 230 days on average every year? So when you engage with American investors and tourism people, they used to say, yeah, but it rains in your country all the time. So I developed my own thought process, like George Boole. And I invented my own Irish analogy that Irish rain is different. It's acid-free. It's good for your complexion. And it's anti-wrinkle. And there were people heard to say, honey, what did that man say about wrinkles there? Interesting that where I come from, we now have the production plant for the global supply of Botox. So, in trying to put a few words together for this, the Philip Monahan lecture, which I'm very privileged to give, I thought about it when I was in Davos last week. In fact, I suppose you could say that putting these few words together, I brought Philip Monahan with me to Davos, at least in notes, because the theme of reshaping the world would probably certainly have interested a man who set out to reshape a city, physically and socially, by building quality public housing for its inhabitants. And these were houses with garden fronts and rear, where people were actually going to live, to grow their roses and their vegetables and to rear their families. Those houses of the Monahan era survive to this day in the French villas and McSweeney's villas and McCurtain's villas, being held in great esteem and great affection by generations of Cork people. And why not? Because they house greatly respected and dignified communities, producing men and women who've made a huge contribution to public services over the years, not only here in Cork, not only in Ireland, but well beyond our shores. How do you build a sense of community? Was the question that President Xi Jinping asked me when he came to Dublin. How do you build a sense of community? Family, connections, community is very important in the Irish psyche, and having decent housing for our people is obviously fundamental to that. As you're well aware here, Philip Monahan began his work of renewal in the very difficult times of the 20s and the 30s. This city had been occupied and burned. The people here were raw, still very raw, after the deaths of their Lord Mayor Terence McSweeney and Thomas McCurtain, and indeed of a son of Cork, Michael Collins. The memory of the Ballycannon boys, civil war, curfews, ambushes, the indignity of having to carry papers in their own city was lived and carried by all Cork people. And at night in houses across the county and across the city, the Great War was fought every night as men and their families struggled with shell shock and the impact of shell shock, or more grievously still, with a sense of shame put on them by those with a limited understanding of what constitutes compassion, heroism and courage. Just a few weeks ago I stood in Flanders Field with the British Prime Minister at the grave of Willie Redmond, who was carried from the Messine Ridge in 1917 by a Protestant to the convent where he received attention and where he died, and the location of which where his grave stands today. His philosophy, having spoken here in Cork as an MP for 32 years representing Clare, was to say to young people, while we believe in the Irish Parliamentary Party and the concept of home rule, if you fight in the British uniform for the freedom of small nations, this might well happen. And clearly the 16th and 36th Regiments, Dublin and Ulster, Protestant and Catholic, were in his words unstoppable if the spirit that applied in their objective in Messine was to be carried through to the country. Almost 100 years on, the same applies in terms of community spirit and an understanding of what we can do if people work together, the common objective and a common interest. Philip Monahan wasn't deterred by all of that background to his work as a public servant. And with his eyes fixed firmly on a horizon in front of him, he set about dismantling the tenements of Cork and housing the people of this city well and comfortably under the differential rent system. He knew that to achieve this, he would have to engage with and to encourage the staff of Cork Corporation to buy into his vision, that all of them, that they would all have to work together in a common purpose to bring those ambitious plans to reform and to fruition. Because he was adamant that the housing itself was not all about the people who would live there. It would suit the people's needs. It would suit the people's lives. It would not be confined or held back by a system. But like Philip Monahan and the city, the government which I have the privilege to lead has been working to recast our economy and to reshape our country. On the first occasion I spoke as Taoiseach, I spoke of how we needed to leave the darkness, to leave Ireland's long economic winter behind us, that we should lift up our heads, that we should turn our faces to the sun as we started the journey of recovery and of renewal. There is no doubt that this has been challenging, that this is difficult, and at times it's been a very harrowing journey for many people. And since the mandate was given to government to fix the broken economy, to get our people back to work, to restore our integrity, our credibility as a nation, to restore our international reputation, it's a conviction of mine in politics that you should not fail or lack in courage in carrying through difficult decisions to where there's higher ground and brighter days. It was obvious that the old ways and the status quo that had brought us to where we were was not going to work for the future. We did something different, something new, like the Monahan agenda, which meant modernising the system of government and administration. Never easy to take an entrenched system and make it fit for purpose, to have a new structure to meet a new age. Equally, it meant seeing that Ireland would travel further on its journey towards becoming a real republic, one that is compassionate, that is more equal, that is inclusive, and that is generous to all its citizens, including our children, who are recognised by the Constitution as citizens in their own right for the very first time. That's why yesterday we had the opportunity to carry through a fundamental and major piece of reform by setting up the Child and Family Agency, the first time in the history of the state to have a senior minister at cabinet level with distinct and specific responsibilities for children and family. After all, being the most precious people that we have in the country, because they are our future. But just 3 years ago, when you looked at the situation that we faced with a shrinking economy, a skyrocketing unemployment, and an exploding deficit, what do? I asked this of a chief executive of a major entity in the United States within a week of being elected. He said the first thing you got to do is show them you're serious. Because people like to have a horizon, they like to have a strategy, they like to have a plan that they can see where the timelines are, where the signposts are, and what it is that you're doing to achieve those. In other words, level with the people and bring them with you. So, just as we entered government with the crushing burden on the people's backs of a troika economic bailout, international reputations in ruins, and blocked out of the international markets, it's been a journey inside those 3 years to exit that bailout successfully last December without a precautionary credit line, and to find that our National Treasury Management Agency can legitimately go back to the open markets at interest rates that have been lower than countries that were not in a bailout program in the first place. And that is due to the understanding of people that nobody's going to fix our problems for us unless we put our own shoulders to the wheel and go back to the old Irish capacity for productivity, hard work and pragmatism in the face of challenges, be they economic, political or whatever. So it's been a difficult time for Ireland, but due to the commitment and the resolve of people, we now see a different prospectus up ahead. Last year there were 58,000 new jobs created in the country. That's a big advance. The important thing to note, however, is that 2/3 of those jobs were created in firms that are less than 5 years old. Now, if you look at the next decade and the way the frontiers of the world are changing, it's obvious that the vast majority of new jobs to be created in the next decade will emerge from companies that in many cases haven't even been heard of yet. Because it's moving at that speed, and that's where we need to have our structures and our capacity to meet those unknown or as yet unpublished works that are going to change the world as we know it, just as George Boole did in his time. So, let me say to you here in UCC, I had the privilege of attending in Davos last week. You have no idea of the scale of international reputation that our people and our country have now gained in such a short time. Because whether they're from the OECD, or the United Nations, or the World Bank, political leaders, financiers, investors all over the planet look at this small country and are quite perplexed as to how our country could move such a distance in such a short time. That's not to say that there's any sort of freedom that we can forget about what happened before. We've got fixed objectives up ahead and we can't lose any momentum. I'm just making the point that internationally people look at Ireland as being an example of what others can do, and were others to do the same, think of the impact of the European Union, for instance, with its 500 million people. So we're now deemed to be, again, highly competitive, a stable location for investment and for jobs. And stability is an inherent requirement for international investment. Investors and sovereign wealth funds like to look at countries where there is stability and where they understand that people and government are focused on making the country a better place. So we want to ensure that the targets we've set of having our deficit below 3% by 2015 GDP, we plan to eliminate it altogether by 2018. By 2020, restore the jobs that we lost in the economic catastrophe that resulted from the banking situation and so on. So we remain and are growing in reputation as a location for establishment, for growth, for investment and enterprise. And here today, in fact, it's great to come to Cork again on this my umpteenth visit here, but on this occasion be able to engage with a number of major firms in terms of economic advancement and job opportunities, and indeed to note that the chief executive of the Apple Corporation will be here later. So the priority for 2014 remains firmly fixed on jobs, because that's the answer to your economic growth. It's the answer to young people being able to live the adventure of life, to contribute to their communities and therefore contribute to their country. So while we've had 19 consecutive months of a fall in the live register at 12.4%, is still unacceptably too high. So the focus of government over the next 18 months will be on dealing with this. So there's no greater threat to the long-term economic and social well-being of this country than our long-term unemployment. And it's been around to so many firms. When you look at the live register, when to change its concept from being a list of disillusioned, disappointed people who don't have anything to offer, to say instead these are men and women, in many cases who have talent, who have experience, who have expertise, who have competence, but our system should not allow them to become bogged down in that rut of disappointment. We need to be vigorous and energetic in saying there is an opportunity for you to play your part, to make your mark, to take a step to advance to where you might like to be. And that's the great challenge, if you like, of restructuring the public service from this point of view. So as deficit falls, reducing unemployment will be the focus now of government. We spent several hours of this yesterday. So we don't want to see economic recovery bypassing the tens of thousands of families who saw their lives turned upside down by the economic collapse. Getting people back to work requires a much more coordinated response among all relevant departments and agencies under government. And what I see, certainly one of the inefficiencies or one of the inadequacies of our system as a country, is that government departments have tended to operate in sort of tunnels, that the connection is not there, that the big push of the Munster pack has never been evident in the sort of national challenge to deal with it from a government point of view. So we've worked very hard as a government to make all ministers, agencies and people under their responsibility to understand that here is the national challenge, and here's a challenge that Ireland can and will rise to. But people have got to understand that they don't just work in an office for the sake of the office. What they do spreads out into the community. And just as you see the beginnings of strong return in Dublin, and to a greater extent the cities of Cork and Limerick and Galway are seeing increased activity, and that's very heartening. But we want to see that spread throughout the communities, smaller and larger towns throughout the country. And that means we have to deal with infrastructure, facilities, broadband, water, power, all of these things, so that people can feel confident where the horizon is and a degree of certainty that they can plan their lives better. And in that sense, this is always a challenge in terms of restructuring public ways. So our Pathways to Work strategy points out a whole range of things like that. Instead of being cast adrift by the state, job seekers now face group engagements, one-on-one interviews. So instead of the old thing of the dole offices that used to be go and sign and get your money, now change this to the intro facilities. You bring together people from the Community Welfare Office, from the Community Services and the Department of Social Protection, and you group them in interviews. What's your experience? What would you like to do? What can you do? What do you want to do? And then sort of employers and corporates and smaller firms and whatever. Here are the advantages of taking on people off the live register. Are you prepared to give somebody 3 months or 6 months? Once you get them back into the motivation of contributing, it becomes so much easier. So we're going to roll out all those offices all over the country by November, 43 of them, and the same with the local enterprise offices, so that somebody with an idea in Bandon or Bantry or in Middleton or wherever, I can say I'm going to walk into the council offices. I've got a one-stop shop here that's going to give me guidance and advice and connections in terms of what it is that I want to do, whether my idea is harebrained or whether it's worthwhile or whether it's practical or not. So given the scale of what we face here, this is going to be an intensive period of work up ahead. Welfare is just one of the areas of public service that's been of importance to us. Another is local government, which I know would be central to what Philip Monahan started out with. And this year we'll see the most fundamental reform of local government in over 100 years, which is going to see us moving from the current form of local government with limited functions that is overly dependent on central funding, one that's very distant from the very communities that it's meant to serve. If you transfer responsibility back down the line, then people have to understand that if they're going to get that responsibility, they have to be prepared to act on it. So we're going to put in place a more coherent system with relevance locally, one that is at the heart of governance and public service, which is based at local level. Who knows better than local people that you should be able to design and do your sewerage scheme for 200 metres instead of having it go off to the Department and Customs House and stay there for 5 or 6 years before you can deal with it. And we've had that capacity at local level through engineering services and all of this for so many years. So local government will actually have a bigger role in promoting economic development through the new local enterprise offices, or the LEOs as they're called. From small beginnings grow mighty trees, as they say. The introduction of the local property tax, an old difficult concept, has been accepted by people. That's going to ensure that there's a direct financial relationship between communities and their local governments, and the responsibility of elected representatives and the executives then is to point out how that's going to be spent and what the plans are for development in any particular area. So that brings greater responsibility and accountability to the role of local elected members, which energises local democracy, if you like. You might say that we have our work cut out for us, by trying to reform the entire public service. Well, we have, but that's spreads it right across the spectrum and not just one part of it. We know only too well that public service has a really central role in underpinning economic growth. And we know that equally, that the quality of our public institutions is a crucial factor in contributing to Ireland's attractiveness for foreign investment. Well, let me say this. This time last year, we assumed the presidency of the European Union. at a very difficult time, both for the country and for the union. Complex issues, with 27 leaders make decisions. It meant 3,000 meetings across the board. I have to say that the public servants who contributed in all these different spheres did a truly outstanding job, because they got the momentum behind them to lift the sort of performance in Ireland's name. And we actually were able to get across the line an extraordinary extent of complex issues at a European level, including the issues of, Mr. Coveney was involved in, for instance, in the Common Fisheries Policy, the Common Agricultural Policy, which sets out the strategy for the next 7 years, which is very important for planning, for development, and for economic expansion in so many areas. But Philip Monahan knew well, the public service doesn't just exist to sustain jobs or to support systems. Our public services exist to serve the people, and its function is to make their lives better, be it in how we're treated in hospital, how we get to work, how well our children are taught in school, the facilities are there, and the safety nets that are required when people, for whatever reason, fall through the barriers. And that's why this January the government published a new public service reform plan, which plans a new wave of reforms across every sector. When you see the way the digital world has moved and how far behind we are in some respects, you can understand that these things are very important. So, in particular, it focuses on how well public services will be able to deliver better services for our people. When you consider the Haddington Road Agreement, very difficult negotiations with Brendan Howland and all of the trades unions. And of course people have different points of view and argue them very vehemently and very cogently. At the end of the day, the unions themselves, after negotiations and deliberation, voted in their entirety for an agreement which is in the national interest and difficult to deal with in many cases, I know. It will deliver 15 million extra working hours from public servants and €1,000 million in savings. It's an extraordinary collaboration between trades unions, public servants and government in the interests of our country. So when we came to government, I said we want to open up this, have it transparent and be it accountable. And that's why we've introduced and expanded the Freedom of Information Act. The restoration and the extension of it is central to the delivery of the government's reform agenda. There's nothing to hide when you're working in the people's interests. And that's to secure greater openness and transparency and accountability of public governance. And that's why you could only implement the Freedom of Information Act, for instance, in respect of Uisce Éireann or Irish Water when it became an entity. So it applies, it's applicable to Irish Water, but goes back to its initiation way back last year, effective, of course, as an entity from the 1st of January. So in addition to reversing the substantive restrictions which were introduced on the Freedom of Information Act in 2003 and extending the Freedom of Information Act to all public bodies, the new bill contains a number of important innovations to update, to modernise and to enhance our legislation. We've also introduced the Protected Disclosures Bill, which will promote the exposure of wrongdoing in the workplace by protecting whistleblowers. Obviously, current discussions are an indication of the complexity of some of the issues here. And we're also introducing the regulation of lobbying legislation, which will create a public register of lobbyists so that their connections and their influence, if any, can actually be traced and it's there for all to see. That's why I say, as Taoiseach, this is probably the most open administration in terms of business and access for business, because it's all about job creation and job opportunities. And that's why, whether I meet the Bunclody Community Council or the Chief Executive of Microsoft, you have somebody there to take the notes and they're there as a record of what the discussions were, so that there's utter transparency, and that's in our people's interests. When you get this opportunity of trust from people, you have to give it back. So there's the record. This is why we had these meetings, and this is what it's all about. So that's why we've also changed the structure of the way legislation is now being drafted. So when ministers bring the heads of a bill to Cabinet and they're approved for approval. They go off to the committees, the Oireachtas committees, for hearings, for consultation, for engagement with the wider community, so that when they're drafted and the report prepared, it helps Cabinet actually produce more competent and more relevant legislation. An outstanding example of that, I'm not saying because it's here, was Deputy Buttermore's chairing of the very sensitive issues arising from the European decision in respect of the rights of women to have a termination of pregnancy in particular circumstances. Very sensitive issues, which was adroitly handled, very well handled, in a Oireachtas committee, where people of very divergent views were able to give those views in a very structured, open and yet disciplined fashion. And that's an example of the new kind of engagement with committees, which are very important. So that pre-legislative role, I think, will lead us to a situation where you don't have, bills travelling from department to department and being finalised before they're ever discussed with the people. Doesn't it make sense to say we engage here with this group long before you ever produce your final product, because some people may well have very relevant views that should be included in the first place. So you talk about transparency. I'd like to think that we wanted to give the representatives of the people, of all the people, whatever party or none they belong to, the right to have their name or names on private members' bills which come through in legislative form in the Dáil and become the law of the land. And that's why we introduced Friday sittings in the Dáil, so that people can say, I've got an issue here, I want to produce this bill. If government like it, or if government are prepared to accept it or amend it, and that person's name, that deputy's name or names can be added to that legislation, saying, this is why I was sent up there, this is one of the reasons I made my contribution, and here's the bill that we drafted and now it's law. So there are 29 private members' bills actually put forward to date, and we'd like to see some of those being directed or amended or accepted by government so that they can actually go through that process. We set up the Constitutional Convention, twice the number of public lay people on it as distinct from public representatives. They've discussed a whole range of things. They've made recommendations to government for consideration for holding referenda on particular matters. So before the end of 2015, obviously, they've made recommendations about reducing the voting age to 16, reducing the age of candidacy for presidential elections from 35 to 21, same-sex marriage, extended their remit just last week to the end of March this year, because they want to look at the question of Dáil reform and the question of social and economic fairness and equality. So we'll wait and see what the recommendations and views of the convention are, and that's why the engagement of public representatives has been so strong, and I have to say very diligently attended to. A commitment before the election was a question on the referendum in the Senate. That was answered clearly by the people. So we now move on to implementing more effective ways that Senate can engage here. Actually, back in 1979, the people decided by referendum to give the right to vote in Senate elections to all graduates. And that bill is now being prepared, and we'll give effect to that and look at a range of other opportunities for the Senate to become more engaged, more effective, and therefore to make its presence felt. So from all of this, you can see that when you're trying to deal with the economic issues, budgetary issues, international issues, and we have to continue to focus on changing our public service so that it delivers. And when you make the phone call and make the contact, that you're not just talking to a machine, but you're talking to a thinking human machine here, which can direct you and give you advice and support. So a lot of work going on in that area. I want to see that there has to be a shift in power from the state to the citizen, a culture and a practice of greater accountability and transparency. They're crucial, so that we give all these young people a chance to have a platform in which to live their lives and make their mark. Democratic government, not least the government of a still young republic, must always be about the common good. It's true, the economic crisis damaged the trust between the citizen and the state. many will say they're all the same. There is no difference. My point of view, there is a difference because we believe with a conviction that the changes we make actually are for the better of the future of our people. To rebuild that trust in the way we've rebuilt it internationally is something that you can only demonstrate and prove by constantly engaging with the people who at the end of the day are ultimately the masters, and they decide and in their decision who they want to represent them. So as Democrats, we have to mind that gap between citizen and the state. And for the sake of our democracy and our citizens, we have to make sure that that gap is filled, and that it's filled to the highest standard with probity and accountability. To do any of it, we need the people, we need all the people, we need the government and people working side by side. Now, I was out in Osaka just a few weeks ago. I met 20 young engineers from Ireland who were there by choice. Some are graduates, some actually had started work, working in the development of turbines for major gas power plants. They actually would make you very proud to see their energy, their bearing, their confidence, the way they carry themselves, and how proud they are of what they can contribute in the renewable energy area or in the energy area in general, and carry that experience back here with them or wherever they wish. So that's why, as we approach the centenary of the first fledgling steps taken in 1916 by those who rose and fought and died as our country made its first faltering steps towards economic and political freedom and independence, it's important that we prepare for a new century. And that means that we should not be afraid to make the decisions that we know will put that platform in place, so that the children who are now starting out in the process of primary schools and preschools and so on will actually have a real opportunity to compete as we know they can against their peers around the world. But the best place to start to rear our children and to start our businesses is in the homes and the communities across the country. And Philip Monahan did that in his time. Before I leave you, let me just say that he would be very pleased, I'm sure, to see how his vision changed not just the face of the city, but the life and the future of its people. For example, up in number 8 French's Villas, the late Packy Ryan grew roses that I understand would rival the best at the Chelsea Flower Show. And in number 3, Mr. and Mrs. Toomey kept a cottage garden that was worthy of adorning the most lavish coffee table production you could find anywhere. All on the green field site at the foot of Fair Hill, famous in song and story, between Fahy's Well and what was once Dan Crane's field. So Philip Monahan's vision brought new life and new hope and new possibility to this city. I believe that he would look at Cork today, and maybe he's looking at Cork today, and see a city that's proud of its roots, one that clings to its values and its traditions, that's always confident of its place in the world. And from my experience of Cork people, they have never lacked in confidence or in humility to say we're always up there with the leaders. It came as no surprise that when Bonrian Eilish Shado came to our shores, that it was in Cork that she got her most rapturous reception and, of course, got to meet the people, the real people. I believe that the story that MI6 had planned to lift one Pat O'Connell in order to raise the happiness quotient across the water is entirely without foundation. I'm going to meet him later on today. Equally, I'm not too sure whether someone did actually say to Her Majesty, Yella, don't worry, you're a grand girl. But if they did, I am sure she was delighted to be treated as one of your own. And when I stood with her on the tarmac at the airport here, she said to me that of all the state visits that she made in 60 years, this was the one that she really wanted to do. So I know that one thing is certain, that it was that very quiet and timid son of Cork, John A. Murphy, who put her very straight on this city's love of sculpture, and that it was not Cork's propensity, actually, to bury British monarchs in the President's garden. John A. explained that in his own inimitable fashion. So if you like, the occasion was truly a Lord or Seal, a day in the life of this ancient and watery and beautiful city where Finbar taught and Munster learned. A city, if you like, whose best days, just like our country's, still lie ahead.